The auditorium lights burned white-hot overhead, casting harsh shadows across 200 faces turned toward the front of the room. Victoria Hayes stood beside the massive whiteboard, designer heels clicking against polished hardwood as she paced, one hand gripping chalk while the other gestured toward a labyrinth of symbols that would look like hieroglyphics to anyone outside her field. The equations sprawled across the board in her precise handwriting, each character perfectly formed, elegant even in its mathematical brutality. Tuesday evening had dissolved into that electric hour when ambition and exhaustion blurred together, when the university transformed from an institution into a stage. Her voice carried across the silent hall with the confidence of someone who had never truly been told no, not in any way that mattered. The words rang out sharp and clear, cutting through the tension that had been building for the past 45 minutes. Fine, solve this equation and I'll marry you. Nervous laughter rippled through the graduate students packed into the tiered seats. Cell phones materialized, camera lights blinking red as the moment crystallized into something shareable, something viral. The live stream counter in the corner of the projection screen ticked upward, 1,500 viewers, 2,000 climbing. Victoria's lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a practiced expression she'd perfected over a decade of academic warfare. She let the moment stretch, savoring the attention, the certainty of her position. Her gaze swept across the auditorium with deliberate slowness, passing over eager faces and expensive laptops, over designer backpacks, in the casual arrogance of wealth that permeated every corner of Whitmore University. Then her eyes found the back exit, where a figure in navy blue coveralls stood frozen beside a cleaning cart, one hand still gripping the handle as if the metal could anchor him to reality. The man's dark eyes scanned the equation with an intensity that seemed out of place on someone wearing a name tag that read M. Chen Facilities. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face: recognition, calculation, understanding. Victoria's smile widened, sharpened into something closer to a weapon. We wouldn't want anyone embarrassing themselves publicly. The implication landed exactly as intended. A few students glanced back at the janitor smirks playing at the corners of their mouths, comfortable in the hierarchy that placed them several rungs above someone whose job involved emptying their trash cans. Marcus Chen's hands tightened on the cart handle, knuckles going white beneath brown skin, but his expression remained carefully neutral. The silence stretched taut as a wire vibrating with unspoken challenge. 3 months earlier, none of this existed. 3 months earlier, Victoria Hayes woke up in her penthouse apartment overlooking the manicured quad of Whitmore University, the early September sun streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and believed she understood exactly how the world worked. Intelligence followed predictable patterns. Excellence required specific credentials. Success belonged to those who earned it through the proper channels. The coffee machine hissed in her kitchen, a $400 Italian espresso maker that produced precisely calibrated shots of caffeine, the same model used in the faculty lounge at Harvard. Steam curled upward as she stood at the marble counter, watching the dark liquid fill her cup, while her mind already raced ahead to the day's agenda. Behind her, the living room stretched out in minimalist perfection. Hardwood floors, gleaming furniture, angular and expensive, every surface carefully curated to project an image of intellectual sophistication. The wall opposite the window served as her personal hall of fame. Frames marched in orderly rows, each containing a certificate that marked a victory in her steady climb toward academic recognition. Harvard PhD summa cum laude, the Latin words printed in formal script. MIT postdoctoral fellowship, the institute's seal embossed in crimson. Cambridge research appointment in heavy paper stock that whispered prestige. Published papers hung between the degrees, first author credits in journals that most people had never heard of, but that everyone in mathematics knew represented the pinnacle of the field. Each frame represented hundreds of hours, thousands of equations, the systematic dismantling of problems that would have broken lesser minds. Victoria carried her coffee to the window and looked down at the campus spreading out below. Students moved along the pathways between buildings, most of them still half asleep at 7 in the morning, clutching their own coffee cups from the artisanal cafe that charged $6 for a latte. Whitmore University occupied 300 acres of prime real estate in rural Connecticut, brick buildings, and white columns arranged around perfectly maintained lawns, oak trees older than the institution itself providing shade for benches where undergraduates pretended to study while scrolling through their phones. The architecture screamed old money tradition, the kind of place where family names appeared on buildings and legacies carried more weight than talent. Her phone buzzed against the counter. Richard's name appeared on the screen, his morning text arriving exactly on schedule. Dinner tonight, that new French place finally has an opening. The restaurant in question required reservations 3 months in advance and served portions so small they qualified as conceptual art. Victoria typed back a quick confirmation, already mentally reviewing her schedule to ensure she could leave campus by 6. Richard Bradford represented everything logical in her carefully constructed life: associate professor at Harvard, impeccable academic pedigree, an understanding of the pressures and politics that define their world. Their relationship functioned like a well-designed proof, each element supporting the others toward a predetermined conclusion. She dressed with the same precision she applied to mathematics, selecting a charcoal suit that cost more than most people spent on rent, pairing it with heels that added 3 inches to her 5'6" frame. The mirror reflected back an image of success authority, someone who belonged in the offices and conference rooms where decisions got made. Dark hair pulled into a flawless twist, minimal makeup applied with geometric precision, diamond studs that caught the light. Only the eyes suggested something more complicated beneath the professional veneer green, with flecks of amber, the kind of eyes that missed very little and forgave even less. The drive to campus took 7 minutes through tree-lined streets where houses sat back from the road behind stone walls and security gates. Victoria's Mercedes glided into the faculty parking lot, sliding into the space marked with her name and the designation department head. The license plate read Proof 1, a small vanity she'd allowed herself after her promotion. Walking across the lot toward the mathematics building, she nodded to the few other early arrivals, maintaining the careful distance that authority required. Inside Euler Hall, the mathematics department occupied the entire third floor of the historic building. Morning light slanted through tall windows, illuminating whiteboards covered in half-erased equations from the previous day's seminars. The hallway smelled of old books and industrial cleaner, that distinctive academic scent that Victoria had learned to associate with achievement. Her office waited at the far end of the corridor, a corner suite with windows overlooking both the quad and the university's famous clock tower. The door's nameplate gleamed in polished brass: Dr. Victoria Hayes, Professor of Mathematics, Department Chair. She'd spent 3 years working toward that title, navigating departmental politics with the same strategic thinking she applied to research problems. The office itself reflected her taste for clean lines and minimal clutter. A massive mahogany desk that had been a gift from Richard, positioned to catch the best light, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with textbooks and journals arranged by topic and year, a small conference table for meetings with graduate students. The whiteboard that dominated one wall currently displayed a proof she'd been working on for the past month, an extension of her doctoral research into functional analysis. The symbols flowed in her characteristic style, rigorous and formal, each step justified by previously established theorems. Victoria stood before it now, chalk in hand, searching for the elegant pathway that would unlock the final section. Mathematics at this level required a particular kind of vision, the ability to see connections that existed only in abstract space, to navigate landscapes built from pure logic. A knock interrupted her concentration. The department secretary, Mrs. Patricia Chen, no relation to the janitor though, Victoria had never bothered to verify, stood in the doorway with a stack of files. "Your 9 o'clock is here early, Dr. Hayes. Should I send her in?" Victoria glanced at her watch. 8:45. She gestured toward the conference table. "Give me 5 minutes." The files contained recommendation letters she'd been putting off, reviewing applications from undergraduates hoping to join the department's graduate program. She skimmed through them with practiced efficiency, sorting them into 3 piles: yes, maybe, and absolutely not. Most fell into the third category: insufficient preparation, weak transcripts, letters that praised enthusiasm rather than actual mathematical ability. One application caught her attention briefly: a community college transfer with perfect grades but no research experience. Victoria hesitated for exactly 3 seconds before adding it to the rejection pile. The standards existed for a reason. The morning's appointment arrived in the form of a nervous second-year PhD student who wanted to switch thesis advisors. Victoria listened with half her attention while the young woman explained her reasons, each excuse more transparent than the last. The real issue barely concealed beneath diplomatic language was that the current advisor expected too much work, pushed too hard, demanded the kind of rigor that separated serious mathematicians from enthusiastic amateurs. Victoria's response came out colder than she'd intended, though she made no effort to soften it. Graduate school is difficult. If you find the expectations unreasonable, perhaps you should reconsider whether this field is right for you. The student's face crumpled slightly, but she nodded and left without further argument. Victoria returned to her proof, already dismissing the interaction from her mind. Excellence required sacrifice. Anyone unwilling to pay that price didn't belong in her department. The faculty meeting at 11 occupied 2 hours of her day, the usual bureaucratic discussions about funding and course schedules. Victoria sat at the head of the long table fielding questions and shutting down debates with the efficiency that had made her the youngest department chair in Whitmore's history. When someone raised the topic of diversity initiatives and outreach to underrepresented communities, she kept her face carefully neutral. Merit should be our only criterion. Lowering standards helps no one in the long run. Several heads nodded in agreement. The professor who'd raised the question, a soft-spoken algebraist named Dr. Robert Kim, looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. The meeting moved on to safer topics. Victoria made notes in the margin of her agenda, already planning how to deflect when the diversity discussion inevitably resurfaced at the next session. Afternoon seminars followed, then office hours where a parade of students sought help with homework problems that should have been trivial to anyone admitted to Whitmore. By 6 o'clock, Victoria's patience had worn thin. She gathered her things and headed for the parking lot, eager to escape campus and lose herself in Richard's uncomplicated company. The French restaurant exceeded expectations, which meant the portions were even smaller and more pretentious than advertised. Richard looked perfectly at home in the candlelit ambiance, discussing a paper he'd just had accepted, while Victoria nodded at appropriate intervals. He was handsome in that academic way, wire-rimmed glasses, carefully tousled hair, going silver at the temples, the kind of face that inspired confidence in lecture halls and grant committees. Halfway through the main course, he mentioned the Ohlers Challenge. "I assume you're organizing it again this year." Victoria dabbed at her lips with the cloth napkin, considering. "The dean insists. Apparently it's good for publicity." Richard's smile carried a hint of condescension. "Nothing wrong with a little theater as long as the standards remain high. Last year's winner came from Yale, correct?" "MIT, actually. Brilliant kid, completely deserving." They discussed the competition's format over dessert, 3 rounds, escalating difficulty, a prize package that included $50,000 and automatic admission to any participating graduate program. Richard suggested several problem types that would separate genuine mathematical maturity from lucky guessing. Victoria filed away his recommendations, already beginning to sketch out the framework in her mind. Walking to her car afterward, Richard's hand resting lightly on her lower back, Victoria felt the comfortable certainty of her position. The world made sense. Intelligence followed predictable paths. Excellence rewarded those who earned it through proper channels, and people stayed in their assigned places. This fundamental order protected the integrity of everything she'd built. 3 blocks from campus, the Mercedes' engine ticked as it cooled in her parking space. Victoria rode the elevator to the 4th floor, keys already in hand, thinking about the proof waiting on her office whiteboard. Tomorrow she'd crack it. Tomorrow she'd find the elegant solution that had been eluding her for weeks. The night settled over Whitmore University in layers of shadow and artificial light. Street lamps created pools of illumination along the pathways. In the dormitories, windows glowed warm with the sounds of parties and study groups. The clock tower chimed midnight, its bells rolling across the quad. Most of the academic buildings went dark, their offices locked, their hallways empty. Most, but not all. In the basement of Euler Hall, Marcus Chen clocked in for his evening shift, exactly on time, sliding his ID card through the reader and waiting for the green light before pushing through the service entrance. The facilities department occupied a windowless warren of rooms that smelled like industrial soap and floor wax lockers lining one-wall-time sheets and safety notices tacked to a bulletin board that nobody ever read. His supervisor, Carl, sat at a battered desk, barely looking up from his phone as Marcus entered. "Chen, buildings 3, 7, and 9 tonight. And stay out of the classrooms when professors are teaching, yeah." Marcus nodded, a small movement that acknowledged the instruction without inviting conversation. He'd learned early in his tenure at Whitmore that the less he said, the less attention he attracted. Attention led to questions, questions led to explanations, and explanations required lying or revealing truths he wasn't ready to share. The locker room's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as he changed into his work uniform navy coveralls, with the university's seal embroidered on the breast pocket, his name tag slightly crooked, no matter how many times he straightened it. Inside his locker door, a photograph caught the overhead light, a family snapshot from another lifetime. His mother, Linda, smiled at the camera, vibrant and healthy, one arm around his younger sister, Lisa, who was frozen mid-laugh. Marcus himself stood between them, wearing an MIT hoodie, younger by 5 years, and, a thousand disappointments, his expression open in a way that felt foreign now. He touched the edge of the photo briefly before closing the locker and loading his cart. Mop bucket, industrial cleaner, trash bags, the tools of a trade he'd never imagined practicing. The cart's wheels squeaked as he pushed it toward the service elevator, a sound that had become as familiar as his own breathing. Building 3 served as the main undergraduate dormitory, a 4-story brick structure that perpetually smelled of pizza and energy drinks. Marcus worked methodically through the common areas, emptying trash cans overflowing with takeout containers and crumpled papers. Students passed him without making eye contact, treating him as part of the furniture, their conversations continuing uninterrupted, even when he had to maneuver around their sprawled legs and scattered belongings. He'd grown accustomed to invisibility, had learned to appreciate the freedom it provided. In the second-floor study lounge, a group worked through calculus problems, their frustration evident in raised voices and eraser shavings scattered across the table. Marcus emptied the nearby trash can, allowing his gaze to drift across their notebooks. The problem they were stuck on involved related rates, a classic application that should have been straightforward. One student had set up the equation correctly, but made an algebraic error in the third line, sending the entire solution down a wrong path. His hand twitched toward the pencil in his pocket. The correction would take 5 seconds, a simple note in the margin. But he caught himself, forced his hand back to the cart handle. That path led nowhere good. He'd learned that lesson during his first month at Whitmore, when he'd left a helpful suggestion on an economics student's homework and received a written warning for inappropriate contact. Janitors clean. They didn't teach. Building 7 housed the main library's 6 floors of books and study carrels that stayed open until 2 in the morning during the semester. Marcus navigated the stacks with practiced efficiency, his cartwheels barely whispering against carpet that absorbed sound like a sponge. The third floor contained the mathematics section, rows of textbooks and journals that represented humanity's accumulated knowledge in his field. He paused here longer than necessary, running his fingers along familiar spines. Rudin's Principles of Mathematical Analysis, its cover worn soft from countless readings. Follin's Real Analysis, dense and unforgiving. Stain and Shakarchi's 4-volume series on analysis, elegant in its progression from basic concepts to advanced theory. A book lay abandoned on a nearby table, left open to a chapter on measure theory. Marcus glanced around, confirming the floor was empty, then allowed himself to read. The author's approach to the Lebesgue integral struck him as unnecessarily complicated, relying on approximation arguments when direct construction would have been clearer. He made a mental note of a simpler proof, filing it away in the part of his mind that never stopped working on mathematics, that couldn't stop even if he wanted it to. Mrs. Chen Patricia, the department secretary, appeared at the end of the aisle, pushing a book cart of returns. She was 70 if she was a day, white-haired and permanently cheerful, a woman who'd worked at Whitmore longer than Marcus had been alive. She smiled when she spotted him. "Still reading those heavy books, Marcus?" He returned her smile, one of the few genuine expressions he allowed himself at work. "Old habit." She moved closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "My grandson's taking calculus at community college. Struggling something terrible. If you ever wanted to make a little extra money tutoring—" Marcus shook his head gently. "I appreciate it, Mrs. Chen, but my schedule's pretty full." The lie came easily, now practiced smooth. His schedule was empty: outside work, and the hospital visits, vast stretches of nothing, punctuated by the mechanical routine of cleaning and sleeping. But tutoring would invite questions, would require explaining how a janitor possessed the knowledge to teach college mathematics. Simpler to decline, to maintain the careful separation between who he appeared to be and who he actually was. Mrs. Chen patted his arm with grandmotherly affection. Well, if you change your mind, you're a good boy, Marcus. Too smart to be pushing a mop. She moved on with her book cart before he could formulate a response. Marcus stood alone among the mathematics texts, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, and felt the familiar weight of displacement settle across his shoulders. Too smart for this, not positioned for anything else. Caught in the gap between capability and opportunity, watching his potential drain away one shift at a time. The library's clock showed 9:45 when he finished the upper floors. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from his sister Lisa, a junior at UConn studying biology. Just a photo of her chemistry textbook with a caption, "Why is organic chem like this?" followed by crying emojis. Marcus smiled despite himself, typed back a brief encouragement, pocketed the phone. Lisa was brilliant in her own right, would make an excellent doctor if she could survive the prerequisite courses. He'd helped pay her tuition with every spare dollar from his paychecks, had tutored her through high school math when their mother got sick and couldn't focus on anything except survival. The service elevator descended to the basement, where Marcus took his regulation 15-minute break. In the small room the facilities department optimistically called a lounge. Plastic chairs, an ancient microwave, a coffee maker that produced liquids somewhere between motor oil and battery acid. He unwrapped the sandwich he'd packed that morning, turkey and cheese on wheat bread, nothing fancy, and ate mechanically while scrolling through news on his phone. The New York Times had published an article about artificial intelligence applications in mathematical research. MIT's mathematics department had announced a new hire, some hotshot from Princeton. The world continued turning while he sat in a basement eating a $5 sandwich. At 10:15, he rolled his cart toward Building 9 Euler Hall, the mathematics department. This building always came last in his rotation, save for the late hours when professors had gone home and the hallways stretched empty and silent. The main entrance required his key card, a special access level granted only to overnight facility staff. The lock clicked open, and Marcus pushed inside, wheels echoing against marble floors in the cavernous entryway. Portraits of famous mathematicians lined the walls leading to the staircase. Euler himself, stern and confident in 18th century dress. Gauss looking severe behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Riemann young and consumptive, dead at 40 before his ideas could fully flower. These men had shaped the foundations of modern mathematics, had seen connections invisible to their contemporaries, had pushed human understanding into new territories. Marcus felt their painted eyes following him as he wheeled his cart past a janitor in navy coveralls carrying trash bags beneath their collective gaze. The third-floor hallway stretched before him, office doors closed and dark except for one at the far end where light spilled out beneath the door. Victoria Hayes's corner office occupied despite the late hour. Marcus had learned her schedule over the past year: early arrival, late departure weekends, spent hunched over whiteboards chasing proofs. Driven by something more than ambition, though he couldn't say what. Fear, maybe, or the need to prove something to herself over and over. He worked quietly, emptying trash cans outside vacant offices, mopping the floor in sections. When he reached Dr. Hayes's door, he paused. Through the frosted glass, he could see her silhouette pacing in front of what must be her whiteboard, chalk in hand. Even from outside the office, he could sense her frustration in the sharp movements, the aggressive strikes of chalk against board. Marcus moved on. Not his business, not his problem. The faculty lounge needed attention. Coffee grounds scattered on the counter. Someone's forgotten lunch moldering in the refrigerator. He cleaned methodically, finding meditation in the simple tasks, the physical labor that required no mental effort. His mind drifted to the research he'd been doing on his own time, a problem in classical analysis that had been bothering him for months. The traditional approach used heavy functional analysis machinery, but he kept feeling like there should be a more direct path, something elegant that cut through the technical complications. The lounge whiteboard bore traces of equations from some earlier discussion, half-erased symbols that formed an incomplete argument about convergence properties. Marcus studied them while wiping down the counter, following the logic to its natural conclusion, spotting the gap where the reasoning failed. Whoever had written this had confused uniform convergence with point-wise convergence, a subtle but critical error. He reached for the eraser, then stopped himself. Not his place, not his role. Instead, he finished cleaning and moved back into the hallway, pushing his cart toward the main lecture hall. Through the small window in the door, he could see the room was empty, chairs in neat rows facing a blackboard that stretched across the entire front wall. The space smelled of chalk dust, in old wood, institutional and timeless. Marcus let himself inside. In the privacy of the empty hall, he allowed himself a moment of imagination. Pictured himself at the front of the room explaining a beautiful proof to eager students, drawing connections that would light up their faces with understanding. This had been the dream once, not the corner office or the prestigious appointments, but this, the simple act of sharing mathematics with people who wanted to learn. Teaching at a small liberal arts college, somewhere modest salary, but meaningful work, helping students discover that mathematics was more than memorization and formulas. The dream had died in a hospital waiting room 5 years ago when a doctor explained the words stage 3 and aggressive treatment and financial responsibility. Dreams were luxuries. Survival was necessity. Marcus pulled his cart to the front of the hall and began cleaning the blackboard, long strokes of the eraser, removing chalk residue from the day's lectures. The familiar motion soothed something in him, connected him tangentially to the mathematical world he'd left behind. As he wiped his eyes, caught on a proof someone had written in the corner, a demonstration involving manifolds and differential forms. The approach was technically correct, but unnecessarily complicated, taking 12 steps where 5 would suffice. His fingers itched to show the better path. From his cart, he retrieved his hidden notebook, the one he kept tucked beneath cleaning supplies where no supervisor would think to look. The cover was worn nearly white, the pages filled with his cramped handwriting proofs and calculations and half-formed ideas. He'd been keeping these notebooks since MIT, a private record of his mathematical life that continued despite everything else. Opening to a blank page, he sketched out the simpler proof, muscle memory, taking over as his hand moved across the paper in familiar patterns. The work absorbed him completely. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The proof flowed onto the page, each line following naturally from the previous building toward the inevitable conclusion. When he finished, Marcus sat back and studied what he'd created. Beautiful in its simplicity, powerful in its directness. This was mathematics stripped of pretension, focused purely on truth. A sound in the hallway snapped him back to reality. Marcus quickly stowed the notebook and returned to his cart, positioning himself to look busy emptying a trash can. The footsteps passed without stopping, another late working professor heading home. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The clock on the wall showed 11:35. His shift ended at 2, still over 2 hours remaining. Marcus finished the lecture hall and moved on to the smaller seminar rooms, checking each one systematically. In the third room, he found remnants of what must have been an intense discussion. Whiteboards covered in competing proof strategies, different colored markers indicating different contributors. A group had been working through a problem in algebraic topology, arguing about the best way to construct a particular proof. Marcus read through their work with growing interest. The problem was legitimately difficult, the kind of question that appeared on qualifying exams for PhD programs. The group had explored several approaches before settling on one that seemed promising, but had a subtle flaw in the sixth line. They'd assumed a certain function was continuous without verifying the necessary conditions. The error would invalidate everything that followed. He stood there for a long moment, chalk in hand, debating. Leaving a correction would be overstepping. These were graduate students, people who should be able to find their own mistakes. But letting them continue down this wrong path felt cruel, a waste of their time and effort. In the end, Marcus compromised. He erased nothing, but in tiny letters at the bottom of the board, he wrote a single question. Is F continuous? No signature, no explanation. Just enough to prompt them to double-check their assumption. They'd either catch the error or they wouldn't. Either way, it wouldn't trace back to him. The digital clock on the wall marked midnight's arrival with a soft beep. Building 9 settled into its overnight silence, heating systems, humming security lights, casting long shadows. Marcus worked through the remaining rooms with the efficiency of long practice, his body moving automatically while his mind returned to the research problem that had been occupying him. There had to be a classical approach, something that didn't require all the modern machinery. The old mathematicians hadn't had access to functional analysis yet. They'd solved similar problems. The key was seeing the underlying structure, the essential nature of what the problem was actually asking. His phone buzzed again as he was mopping the third-floor hallway. This time the call, not a text, his mother's number. Marcus's heart rate spiked. Calls this late never brought good news. He fumbled the phone out of his pocket, nearly dropping it in his haste. Ma, what's wrong? Linda Chen's voice came through thin but steady, containing that particular forced cheerfulness she used when trying to hide pain. Nothing's wrong, sweetheart. I just couldn't sleep and wanted to hear your voice. Marcus leaned against the wall, gripping the phone tighter. It's midnight. Are you feeling okay? Did you take your medication? Yes, yes, I took everything. The new pills make me restless, that's all. In the background, Marcus could hear the faint beep of medical equipment, the sounds of the long-term care facility where his mother had lived for the past 6 months. Remission was holding the cancer pushed back, but never truly gone, lurking at the edges of every blood test and scan. The facility cost $3,000 a month insurance, covering barely half. Marcus's paychecks disappeared into that gap, along with the money from his weekend shifts at the grocery store and the odd jobs he picked up whenever possible. I saw you on the news the other day. Marcus's stomach dropped. What? Linda's laugh carried genuine delight. Some local story about unusual hobbies. They were interviewing people outside the library, and you walked past in the background. My boy's still reading those mathematics books. Relief washed through him. She hadn't seen anything about the competition, didn't know he'd registered for the Euler's Challenge under his real credentials. He'd been careful to avoid media attention, to stay at the edges of public view, but local news cameras were unpredictable. Just staying sharp, Ma. You should go back to school. Finish what you started. They'd had this conversation 100 times, the same gentle pressure she'd been applying since the day he'd withdrawn from MIT. Marcus closed his eyes. Soon, the bills are almost paid off. I don't want you sacrificing your future for me. It's not a sacrifice. It's what family does. Silence stretched between them, loaded with everything they'd learned not to say. The opportunities lost the potential, squandered the mathematical career that had evaporated like morning mist. Linda had always known he was special, had encouraged his obsession with numbers, as a child had scrimped and saved to buy him used textbooks, had beamed with pride when MIT's acceptance letter arrived. Watching him throw it all away to care for her had broken something in her that no amount of reassurance could fix. Your father would be so proud of who you've become. Marcus's throat tightened. His father had died when he was 14, a construction accident that left the family scrambling financially, but had also left him with a fierce determination to build something meaningful with his life, to honor the sacrifice of immigrant parents who'd worked themselves to exhaustion so their children could have better opportunities. Get some rest, Ma. I'll visit on Sunday after my shift. Come earlier if you can. We'll watch those nature documentaries you like. After they hung up, Marcus stood in the empty hallway for several minutes, phone still pressed to his ear, letting the weight of his choices settle across his shoulders. 27 years old, PhD candidate dropout, janitor at the university where he should have been teaching, trapped in amber by circumstances that had demanded everything and given nothing back. But his mother was alive. Remission was holding. That had to be enough. Marcus returned to work, pushing his cart toward the final section of offices. Victoria Hayes's light was still on, visible as a golden rectangle beneath her door. 1 in the morning and she was still working, still chasing whatever proof had her so frustrated. Marcus wondered briefly what drove her, what inner demon demanded such relentless effort. From what he'd observed over the past year, Dr. Hayes worked harder than anyone else in the department, arrived earlier, stayed later, published more papers, maintained impossibly high standards for herself and everyone around her. He'd read some of her work, hard not to, given that her publications were available through the library's online databases. Her mathematics was rigorous, to the point of being aggressive, every step justified with formal precision, no intuition allowed to stand without proof. Technically flawless, but somehow cold, missing the elegance that made truly beautiful mathematics sing, like reading a legal brief instead of poetry. The door to her office opened abruptly. Victoria emerged, nearly colliding with Marcus's cart, her face flushed with frustration. Up close, he could see the exhaustion around her eyes, the way her hair had begun to escape its precise arrangement, the chalk dust on her expensive suit jacket. She pulled up short, surprise flickering across her features at finding someone in the hallway at this hour. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. Marcus registered the intelligence in her eyes, the defensive set of her shoulders, the way she held herself like someone perpetually ready for attack. Victoria's gaze traveled over his uniform, his name tag, his cleaning cart, cataloging and dismissing in the space of a heartbeat. The bathrooms are down the hall. Her voice carried the particular dismissiveness of someone who'd never had to worry about being dismissed themselves. Marcus nodded, already moving his cart, giving her the space she clearly wanted. But her next words stopped him. "Do you know anything about mathematics?" The question came out sharp, almost aggressive, like an accusation. Marcus turned back slowly, keeping his expression carefully neutral. "A little." Victoria's laugh held no humor. "Everyone thinks they know a little mathematics. Let me guess, you can balance a checkbook." The condescension stung more than it should have. Marcus had learned to let this kind of comment slide off to preserve his energy for things that actually mattered. But something about the raw frustration in her voice, the late hour, the weight of his mother's phone call, it all combined to strip away his usual caution. "I was thinking more along the lines of differential equations." Her eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. Skepticism radiated from every line of her posture. "Really? And where did you study differential equations? Community college?" "MIT, actually." The words slipped out before he could stop them, honest in a way he hadn't been with anyone at Whitmore. Victoria's expression shifted from condescension to confusion to something harder to read. Her eyes narrowed, reassessing. "MIT. The janitor went to MIT." Marcus could hear the disbelief, the assumption that he must be lying or exaggerating some night school course into something more impressive. He should have shut his mouth, should have backed away and let the moment dissolve. Instead, momentum carried him forward. PhD program, Mathematics Department, 2014 to 2018. Now her expression hardened into something that looked like anger, though Marcus couldn't understand why. Victoria crossed her arms, a defensive gesture that made her seem younger despite the power suit. "If you're such a mathematical genius, what are you doing cleaning floors at Whitmore?" The question cut straight to the core of every choice he'd made for the past 5 years. Marcus met her gaze steadily, refusing to look away first. "Life doesn't always go according to plan." For a moment, something flickered in Victoria's eyes, recognition perhaps, or a distant echo of understanding. Then it vanished, replaced by the cool professional mask she wore like armor. "Well, I'm sure your MIT education serves you well in facilities management." She turned to go, dismissing him more thoroughly than any words could have. But Marcus's patience, worn thin by exhaustion and emotional weight, finally snapped. "You have an error in your proof." Victoria froze mid-step, turned back slowly, her face a mask of barely controlled rage. "Excuse me." Marcus nodded toward her office, where the whiteboard was visible through the open door, covered in her meticulous handwriting. "Line 7, your inequality goes the wrong direction when you apply the norm." The silence that followed felt dangerous, electric, with tension. Victoria's face flushed deep red, whether from embarrassment or fury, Marcus couldn't tell. She strode back to her office, leaving the door open in what might have been an invitation or a challenge. Marcus hesitated, then followed, knowing he had already crossed a line, but unable to stop now. The whiteboard dominated the wall, filled with a proof attempting to establish some property of Banach spaces. Marcus scanned it quickly, his mind automatically following the logical flow, checking each step. The error jumped out at him immediately, a subtle mistake in line 7 where Victoria had reversed an inequality, a small slip that invalidated everything afterward. The kind of error that was easy to make when you'd been staring at symbols for hours, when exhaustion wore down the mental filters that normally caught such things. "There," Marcus pointed. "When you apply the norm to both sides, you need to reverse the inequality because you're dealing with a decreasing function." Victoria stared at the board, her face going through a complicated series of expressions. She picked up chalk and worked through the relevant sections silently, her movements growing more agitated. After 2 minutes, she threw the chalk down, hard enough that it shattered against the desk. "Damn it!" The janitor was right. A man in coveralls who smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals had spotted an error she'd missed for 3 days. Victoria turned to face him, and Marcus saw something close to panic in her eyes beneath the anger. "How did you see that?" He shrugged, a small movement. "Experience. I've made the same mistake before." "In your MIT PhD program." The skepticism was back, but weaker now, undermined by the evidence of his correction. Marcus said nothing, just held her gaze. After a moment, Victoria looked away first. "Get out." Her voice came out cold, final, the tone of someone used to being obeyed without question. Marcus nodded and retreated, pulling the door closed behind him. In the hallway, his hand shook slightly as he gripped the cart handle. He'd been stupid reckless, had let wounded pride overcome common sense. Now she knew he had real mathematical knowledge, which meant questions would follow questions he couldn't answer without revealing everything. Behind the closed door, he heard Victoria's muffled voice, sharp with frustration, probably talking to herself or maybe on the phone with someone. Marcus hurried away suddenly, desperate to finish his shift and escape the building. The rest of the night passed in a blur of mechanical tasks. Empty trash mop floors, wipe surfaces, repeat. Marcus worked on autopilot, his mind replaying the encounter with Dr. Hayes, cataloging all the ways he'd mishandled it. By the time 2 a.m. arrived, he was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. A bone-deep weariness that came from maintaining secrets, from living a life split between who he appeared to be and who he actually was. Carl was still at the desk when Marcus clocked out, barely looking up from his phone. Everything good. All clean. Outside, the September night had cooled to that perfect temperature between summer and fall. Marcus walked to his car, a 15-year-old Honda with a dented bumper and questionable air conditioning, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Campus stretched around him in peaceful darkness, buildings like sleeping giants, pathways empty except for occasional security patrols. Beautiful in its way. A temple to knowledge and achievement built on foundations of money and privilege that people like him could only access through the service entrance. His phone buzzed, a text from Lisa. Can't sleep. Stressed about organic chem midterm. Marcus typed back, you'll do great. Remember what we talked about? The mechanisms are just patterns. Learn the patterns and everything else follows. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, thanks. You should sleep too. Love you. Love you too, kid. The drive home took 15 minutes through empty streets. Marcus lived in a studio apartment in the cheap part of town, the kind of place where sirens were background music and the neighbors changed monthly. Rent was $900, utilities another $100, leaving him just enough from his paychecks to cover his mother's facility costs and groceries. The apartment itself was barely large enough for a bed and a desk, but it was his paid for with honest work, and nobody could take it away as long as he kept making rent. Inside, he didn't bother turning on lights, just dropped his bag, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the bed, still wearing his clothes. Exhaustion pulled him under immediately, but his dreams were troubled, filled with whiteboards and equations that dissolved before he could solve them, with voices asking questions he couldn't answer, with his mother's face as he told her he was giving up MIT. 3 hours later, his alarm dragged him back to consciousness. Marcus lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to summon the energy to start another day. His weekend shift at the grocery store started at 5 hours of stocking shelves and dealing with customers who looked through him the same way Victoria Hayes had in the hallway. Then Sunday would bring hospital visits, laundry, the endless maintenance required to keep his small life functional. But between the cracks of survival, mathematics leaked through. On the bus to the grocery store, Marcus worked through problems in his head, testing new approaches to the classical analysis question that had been bothering him. During his lunch break, he sketched proofs in a notebook hidden beneath his employee handbook. At night, after his mother fell asleep during their TV time, he stayed up solving problems from old MIT textbooks, keeping his mind sharp, refusing to let the part of himself that was a mathematician atrophy completely. Monday morning arrived with Victoria Hayes sitting in her office at 7 a.m. having barely slept, staring at the corrected proof on her whiteboard. The janitor, Marcus Chen, MIT PhD dropout, had been right. The correction he'd suggested worked perfectly, unlocking the section that had been blocking her for days. But his accuracy wasn't what kept Victoria awake. It was the implications. She'd spent the weekend researching. MIT's online directory confirmed a Marcus L. Chen had been enrolled in the mathematics PhD program from 2014 to 2018, status listed as withdrawn. No public dissertation, no graduation record. 2 published papers in the Annals of Mathematics under that name, both from 2017, both dealing with classical approaches to modern analysis. Victoria had read them 3 times, growing more unsettled with each reading. The papers were brilliant. Not just competent, not just publishable, but genuinely insightful work that opened new perspectives on old problems. The writing style was distinctive, favoring geometric intuition over algebraic manipulation, finding elegant shortcuts that bypassed technical complications. Exactly the kind of mathematics that her own advisors had criticized as insufficiently rigorous, the kind she'd trained herself not to produce. And the author of these papers was emptying her trash cans. Victoria pulled up Whitmore's HR database, technically violating several policies, but unable to stop herself. Marcus Chen's employment file was sparse. Hired September 2019, worked night shift, clean disciplinary record, no complaints. Under education, the form listed only high school diploma. Previous employment was blank. Emergency contact Linda Chen relationship listed as mother. No mention of MIT, no mention of 2 papers in one of the most prestigious mathematics journals in the world. Either he'd deliberately hidden his credentials or the HR department had never bothered to check. Victoria suspected both. The question that consumed her through a sleepless weekend was simple: why? Why would someone with PhD-level credentials work as a janitor? Why hide that background? What had happened between 2018, when he withdrew from MIT, and 2019, when he appeared at Whitmore pushing a cleaning cart? Her phone rang. Richard calling from Harvard, where he was teaching a morning seminar. Victoria almost didn't answer, but habit and obligation won out. "You sound terrible." "Thanks, Richard. Your charm is overwhelming." "I'm serious. You haven't called back all weekend. Everything okay?" Victoria hesitated, unsure how to explain her obsession with the janitor. She settled on a version of the truth. "Remember that diversity question at the faculty meeting? I've been thinking about how we evaluate talent." Richard's sigh came through clearly. "Catherine, we've discussed this. Standards exist for a reason. Opening doors too wide dilutes excellence. But what if we're missing people? What if there's genuine talent we're not seeing because we're looking in the wrong places? Then they'll find their way eventually. Merit always rises." The certainty in his voice, the comfortable assumption that the system worked correctly, grated against Victoria's growing doubts. She changed the subject, let Richard talk about his research and departmental politics until she could extract herself from the conversation. After hanging up, she sat in her office watching campus wake up outside her window. Students emerging from dorms. Professors arriving with coffee cups, the daily choreography of academic life, unfolding exactly as it had for decades. Somewhere in that choreography, Marcus Chen was probably sleeping after his night shift, unaware that Victoria was pulling every thread she could find, trying to understand his story. The thought made her uncomfortable, this invasion of privacy, this obsessive need to classify and understand. But she couldn't stop. Something about his quiet competence, his hidden credentials, his willingness to correct her, despite the social cost it all, suggested a narrative she desperately needed to understand. The faculty meeting that afternoon brought an announcement from Dean Morrison. The annual Rollers Challenge would take place in 6 weeks, registration opening immediately. Victoria had the competition framework, already planned problems selected to test genuine mathematical maturity rather than memorized techniques. The prize remained the same: $50,000 in automatic PhD admission to any participating institution. As department chair, Victoria was expected to encourage participation to generate enthusiasm for the competition. She gave her speech on autopilot, emphasizing the intellectual rigor required, the prestige associated with winning. But her mind kept drifting to Marcus Chen, wondering if he knew about the competition, wondering if someone with his background would consider entering. The answer came Wednesday evening during her graduate seminar on advanced topology. 30 PhD students filled the room. Notebooks open, attention focused on the blackboard, where Victoria was demonstrating applications of the Banach fixed-point theorem. She was in her element, commanding the room with the same confidence that had carried her through Harvard and MIT, in Cambridge, building a complex argument step by careful step. At 3:15, the door opened quietly. Marcus entered with his cleaning cart, clearly trying to be invisible as he headed for the trash can at the back of the room. Students barely noticed him, their eyes following Victoria's chalk as it moved across the board. Victoria paused mid-sentence, derailed by his presence, but forced herself to continue. The proof required establishing that a certain function was a contraction mapping, which would guarantee the existence of a unique fixed point. Victoria worked through the technical details, building toward the final conclusion. When she wrote the last line, several students applauded, a rare acknowledgement in graduate seminars. Richard Bradford, visiting from Harvard to give a guest lecture later in the week, sat in the front row, nodding approvingly. "Elegant as always, Victoria." She smiled, accepting the compliment, already turning to take questions. But in her peripheral vision, she saw Marcus freeze at the trash can, staring at the board with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. His expression had shifted from polite neutrality to focused concentration, the look of someone following a complex argument to its conclusion and finding it lacking. Victoria knew that look, had seen it on her own face in mirrors on her advisors' faces when she'd made an error. Marcus Chen had spotted something wrong with her. Proof was working through exactly where the argument failed. Her first instinct was panic, not again, not in front of 30 students and Richard Bradford. Her second instinct was anger. Who was this janitor to question her mathematics twice in 1 week? But Marcus didn't interrupt. He finished with the trash, gave no indication that he'd noticed any problem, and left as quietly as he'd entered. The door clicked shut behind him. Victoria tried to refocus on the seminar to field questions and facilitate discussion, but part of her mind was racing back through the proof, checking each step. Line 7. Of course, a subtle error where she'd assumed a function was continuous without verifying the necessary conditions. The kind of mistake that would invalidate everything that followed, that would propagate through the remainder of the argument like a virus. Victoria felt blood rise to her face, forced herself to stay calm. Let's take a short break. Back in 10 minutes. Students filed out, eager for coffee and bathroom breaks. Richard approached the front, concern on his face. You look flushed. Feeling all right? Fine, just need some air. She hurried into the hallway looking for Marcus. He'd already moved on to another floor, but his cart was visible down the corridor, its distinctive squeak audible in the quiet building. Victoria quickened her pace, catching up to him outside a vacant classroom. Mr. Chen, he turned, surprise flickering across his features. Up close, Victoria noticed details she'd missed during their first encounter, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he held himself with quiet dignity, despite the uniform, the chalk dust on his hands, that suggested he'd been writing equations somewhere. Dr. Hayes, I need to ask you something. Marcus waited, expression carefully neutral, giving her nothing. My proof, in the seminar just now. Did you notice anything? For a long moment, he said nothing. Victoria could see him weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, he spoke quietly. Line 7. You assumed F is continuous, but didn't verify it satisfies the conditions. There it was, confirmation delivered in the same calm tone he'd used to point out her previous error. Victoria's hands clenched at her sides. And you determined this, how in the 30 seconds you were in the room. The structure was clear. Checking continuity would have taken longer than the whole proof, which suggested you'd skipped it. He wasn't being arrogant, wasn't gloating. Just stating facts with the precision of someone who understood mathematics at a fundamental level. Victoria felt something shift inside her, a crack in the careful certainty she'd maintained about how the world worked. Why are you here? Why Whitmore? Why facilities? Why hide what you can clearly do? Marcus's expression closed off, became unreadable. I needed a job. They were hiring. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving. He turned to go, but Victoria's next words stopped him. The Euler's challenge. Are you planning to enter? Marcus paused, didn't look back. I haven't decided. You should, the prize money alone. I know what the prize is, Dr. Hayes. Now he did turn, and Victoria saw something fierce in his eyes, something that suggested depths she'd only begun to glimpse. I know exactly what it is. The question is whether I can afford to compete. Afford the entry is free. Marcus's smile was sad, knowing. Not all costs are financial. He left before she could respond, his cart squeaking away down the corridor. Victoria stood alone, her mind spinning through implications and questions. What did he mean by costs? What was he hiding? And why did she care so much about the answers? The next morning, Victoria found herself doing something she'd never done before, visiting the facilities department in the basement of the administration building. Carl looked up from his desk with barely concealed surprise when she walked in, clearly unused to faculty members venturing into his domain. Dr. Hayes, something wrong with the cleaning? No, nothing like that. I had a question about one of your employees, Marcus Chen. Carl's expression shifted to defensive wariness. Chen He in some kind of trouble? Not at all, I was just curious about his background. His application mentioned education at MIT. The supervisor shook his head. Just high school diploma on his file. Guy's quiet, does good work, never causes problems. Why? Victoria realized she'd reached a dead end. Pushing further would only raise suspicions, might even create problems for Marcus. She manufactured a smile. Just following up on something. Thank you for your time. Walking back across campus, Victoria felt the full weight of her obsession settling over her. She was department chair at a prestigious university, had research deadlines and teaching responsibilities and administrative duties. And here she was chasing down information about a janitor who'd corrected her proofs twice. The behavior bordered on irrational, but she couldn't let it go. Something about Marcus Chen's story pulled at her, demanded understanding. Maybe because his hidden brilliance challenged every assumption she'd built her career on, that excellence required proper credentials, that talent naturally found its level, that the system worked correctly to identify and promote the deserving. If someone as capable as Marcus could end up cleaning toilets, what did that say about everything Victoria believed? The registration period for Euler's Challenge opened Thursday morning. Victoria reviewed the list of early signups, expecting the usual suspects: ambitious graduate students from top programs, a few confident undergraduates, maybe an adjunct faculty member looking to make a name. By noon, 12 people had registered their credentials, reading like a who's who of elite mathematics education. Harvard, MIT, Yale, Stanford, Princeton. Marcus Chen's name was not among them. Victoria told herself it was relief she felt, not disappointment. Better this way, cleaner, no complications. She could refocus on her actual work. Forget about the mysterious janitor and his hidden PhD credentials. Except she couldn't. Her attention kept drifting to the registration portal, checking for new names, hoping against logic to see his appear. Friday brought another encounter. Victoria had stayed late in her office working on revisions to a paper under review. Around 11 p.m., hungry and frustrated, she ventured to the faculty lounge for the questionable coffee that was all the building offered at this hour. The lounge was empty, or so she thought, until she noticed Marcus inside wiping down counters. He looked up when she entered, a recognition flashing in his eyes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Victoria moved to the coffee maker, suddenly self-conscious about the silence. Working late. It wasn't a question, and Marcus didn't treat it as one. He continued cleaning, giving her space. Victoria poured coffee she didn't really want, searching for words that wouldn't sound like prying or judgment. "I've been reading your papers." That got his attention. Marcus's hands stilled on the counter, and he turned to face her fully. "My papers. The ones in annals. Classical approaches to modern analysis. They're brilliant." His expression was impossible to read: surprise, maybe, or resignation, or something more complicated. "Thank you. Why aren't you using that? The talent, the publication record, you could get positions." Marcus cut her off gently but firmly. "Dr. Hayes, I appreciate your interest, but my life is complicated in ways I don't care to explain to someone I barely know." The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Victoria had no right to this information, no claim on his story. She was being intrusive, pushing boundaries that professional courtesy demanded she respect. "I'm sorry, you're right." She started to leave, but Marcus spoke again, his voice softer. "The Euler's Challenge. Is the marriage proposal serious?" Victoria turned back, confused, then remembered the flippant comment she'd made during the faculty announcement. She'd been joking, trying to emphasize the difficulty of the competition. But Marcus's expression suggested he'd taken it differently, had heard challenge rather than humor. "No, of course not. That was just hyperbole." "Yes." He nodded slowly, something shifting in his posture. "I'm going to register." Victoria's heart rate spiked without her permission. "You are, tomorrow, if that's okay with the department chair." There was an edge to his voice now, a quiet defiance that Victoria recognized because she'd felt it herself countless times. The determination of someone who'd been told they didn't belong, who'd decided to prove otherwise. "It's open to all university personnel. You're more than qualified." Marcus smiled, but there was no joy in it. "We'll see about that." He left the lounge, leaving Victoria alone with cold coffee and racing thoughts. Marcus Chen was going to compete. The janitor with MIT credentials and papers in annals was going to enter the Euler's Challenge. The implications cascaded through her mind: media attention, questions about his background, the exposure he'd clearly been trying to avoid. Why would he risk it? The answer came to her, slowly built from fragments of their conversations and the intensity she'd seen in his eyes. Marcus was tired of hiding, tired of being invisible, of watching his talent go unrecognized, of cleaning floors while his mind worked through problems that would challenge the best mathematicians in the world. The competition offered validation proof that he belonged in the academic world, despite the credentials he'd left behind at MIT. And Victoria had challenged him to prove it. Saturday morning, Marcus's name appeared on the registration list. Contestant number 12 listed simply as Marcus Chen, Facilities Department, Whitmore University. No mention of MIT, no previous education beyond what HR had on file. To anyone reading the list, he would appear completely out of place among the Ivy League graduate students and decorated scholars. Victoria stared at his name on the screen, knowing she'd set something in motion that would change everything. The competition was 6 weeks away, 6 weeks for Marcus to prepare for rumors to spread, for the story of the janitor challenger to build momentum. 6 weeks for Victoria to figure out what she really wanted from this situation, validation of her own beliefs about merit and credentials, or something more complicated that she wasn't ready to name. Her phone buzzed. Richard texting about dinner plans. Victoria ignored it, still staring at the registration list at the name that didn't belong, but refused to be ignored. Marcus Chen had thrown down a gauntlet she didn't fully understand. The only way forward was to see where it led. Outside her window, Whitmore University basked in September sunshine, ivy-covered walls, and perfect lawns, projecting an image of timeless academic excellence. Somewhere in that landscape, Marcus Chen was probably sleeping after his night shift, preparing for another week of being invisible, while his mind worked on mathematics that would humble most PhD candidates. But invisibility had an expiration date. In 6 weeks, everyone would see exactly what Victoria had already discovered: that brilliance didn't respect boundaries, that intelligence refused to stay hidden, that the careful hierarchies she'd spent her life believing in were more fragile than she'd ever imagined. The Euler's challenge would either prove Marcus Chen belonged in the academic world despite his unconventional path, or it would expose him as talented, but ultimately limited by his lack of formal completion. Victoria realized with uncomfortable clarity that she desperately wanted him to succeed, not because it would validate anything about her own choices, but because his success would mean the system she'd navigated so carefully was more just than she feared, more open to merit regardless of circumstance. If Marcus could prove himself on his terms, maybe there was hope for everyone else who'd been told they didn't belong. The challenge had been issued. The players were in position. All that remained was to see who would prove strong enough to win a game where the stakes ran deeper than $50,000, or academic credentials, or even the flippant marriage proposal that had started this whole cascade. The stakes were truth itself, about talent, about worth, about the stories people told themselves to justify the worlds they'd built. And Victoria Hayes was beginning to suspect that the truth might shatter everything she thought she knew. The first problem materialized on the projection screen at exactly 10:05, simultaneously appearing on printed sheets distributed to each contestant. Victoria's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel, clinical and precise. "You have 90 minutes. Begin." Marcus stared at the problem, his mind automatically parsing the mathematical language into something his intuition could grasp. Find the maximum value of a function subject to a constraint, undergraduate calculus, deliberately accessible, designed to separate people who'd registered on confidence from those who actually understood what they were doing. Around him, chalk began scratching against boards as contestants deployed the techniques they'd learned in expensive classrooms. Jennifer Park from Harvard attacked it with Lagrange multipliers, her movements efficient, in practice the kind of mechanical precision that came from solving hundreds of similar problems under time pressure. David Richardson followed the same path, slightly faster, his chalk forming symbols with aggressive confidence. The other Ivy League students converged on identical approaches, their expensive educations manifesting in uniform problem-solving strategies that would all arrive at the same answer through the same well-worn pathway. Marcus didn't move for 30 full seconds. His stillness drew attention from nearby contestants, glances that mixed curiosity with contempt. Was the janitor already stuck on the easiest problem? Victoria watched from the judging panel, her expression unreadable, but her posture radiating expectation of exactly this outcome. Then Marcus picked up chalk and began drawing. Not equations, not the formal symbolic manipulation that every other contestant employed. A circle appeared on his board, clean and perfect, despite being freehand. Inside it, he sketched vectors radiating from the center, added a curved surface, representing the function's values labeled critical points with minimal notation. The mathematics emerged visually geometrically, revealing the answer through insight rather than calculation. 3 minutes. Marcus stepped back from his completed solution, the answer sitting clearly labeled with a brief explanation of the geometric reasoning that made it obvious why the maximum had to occur at that exact point. Victoria's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips, suspended in midair while her mind processed what she was witnessing. Around the auditorium, whispers began as spectators realized what had just happened. The live stream chat visible on monitors throughout the room exploded with comments flooding faster than anyone could read. Marcus remained seated, eyes closed again, conserving energy while his competitors continued their laborious calculations. 15 minutes into the session, problem 2 appeared. A matrix analysis question requiring determination of eigenvalues, graduate-level difficulty, designed to separate the truly prepared from the merely competent. The Ivy League contingent attacked it with systematic calculation, set up the characteristic polynomial, expand the determinant, solve the resulting equation. Jennifer Park worked through the expansion with impressive accuracy, each step verified before moving forward. Marcus studied the matrix for perhaps 20 seconds. Then he wrote a single sentence: discrete vibrating string boundary conditions. Below it, 4 eigenvalues appeared directly accompanied by a brief note invoking symmetry properties and classical physics results. 5 minutes. He'd solved in 5 minutes what should have required 30, had bypassed all the technical machinery by recognizing the matrix's physical interpretation, by seeing through abstraction to the concrete problem that originally motivated the theory. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the visiting judge from Stanford, leaned forward with sudden intensity, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. The audience noise level climbed perceptibly. Phones multiplied throughout the room, students recording Marcus's boards, uploading to social media, spreading word that something unprecedented was unfolding. The live stream counter ticked past 10,000 viewers, then 15,000, the numbers accelerating as clips went viral beyond mathematics communities into general interest platforms. Jennifer Park glanced toward Marcus's work, her confident expression flickering into uncertainty. David Richardson's chalk paused mid-symbol, his hand frozen as peripheral vision reported something his conscious mind refused to accept. A janitor wasn't supposed to be outpacing them. The natural order didn't permit this kind of inversion. Problem 3 pushed into research territory, prove convergence, and find the sum of a specific infinite series, the kind of question that appeared on PhD qualifying exams, and exposed the difference between people who understood analysis at a fundamental level and those who'd merely memorized techniques. David Richardson recognized it first, deploying partial fraction decomposition with the confidence of someone who'd seen similar problems in graduate seminars. Marcus wrote 2 lines. First, the partial fraction breakdown that Richardson was laboriously deriving, n and 2 plus n equals 1 on n, 1 on n plus 1. Second, in one word, telescoping. Below that, he showed how the infinite series collapsed terms, canceling in pairs, like dominoes falling in reverse, leaving only the first term. The sum appeared 1. A final observation: basal problem connection via limiting argument. 7 minutes total across all 3 problems. Marcus had solved everything in the time most contestants spent reading the first question. The disparity was so extreme, it looked suspicious, like he'd somehow seen the problems beforehand or memorized solutions. But Victoria knew that was impossible. She'd created these problems herself, last week had shown them to no one, except the judging panel. The remaining 83 minutes crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Contestants worked through calculations, erasing and rewriting sections that didn't resolve correctly. Marcus sat motionless in his chair, hands folded in his lap, eyes closed, apparently resting while everyone else struggled. Or perhaps sleeping. He'd worked until 2 that morning, had probably managed 3 hours of unconsciousness before dragging himself here. Victoria found herself unable to look away from him, this man in coveralls who was systematically dismantling every assumption she'd built her worldview on. His solutions weren't just correct, they were more elegant than her own model answers, revealed deeper understanding than years of formal training typically produced. The mathematics he'd written on those boards represented the kind of insight that couldn't be taught, could only be cultivated through genuine love of the subject and thousands of hours of independent thought. When time expired, Marcus jerked slightly as if waking from sleep. Around him, students scrambled to finish final calculations, some still working on problem 2, a few having barely started problem 3. The contrast between his sparse boards and their densely packed work felt almost cruel, highlighting the gap between genuine understanding and mechanical application of techniques. Judges convened for preliminary scoring, a process that should have been straightforward, but immediately ran into complications around Marcus's solutions. Dr. Kim argued for strict interpretation solutions, should demonstrate mastery of formal techniques, should follow accepted mathematical practice, shouldn't rely on shortcuts that bypassed rigorous justification. Professor Warner from the physics department countered that elegance was its own form of rigor, that finding the most direct path to truth revealed deeper understanding than mechanical application of standard methods. Dr. Chen from NYU pointed out that correctness was ultimately objective, regardless of methodology, that Marcus's answers were verifiably right, even if his approaches were unconventional. Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the debate with quiet authority that silenced the room. These solutions represent mathematical thinking at the highest level. The ability to see essential structure beneath technical complexity, to recognize patterns across different areas, to communicate profound insights with minimal notation. These are marks of genuine genius, not deficiency. The passion in her tone seemed excessive for a visiting professor evaluating a campus competition. Victoria studied Mitchell's face, noting the intensity there, the way her eyes kept drifting back toward Marcus's boards, as if seeing something that triggered memories she couldn't quite access. Results were announced in ascending order, building tension through carefully timed pauses. Contestants who'd placed 7th through 12th received polite applause and sympathetic nods. Solid effort. Given the competition, level, better luck next year. 6th through 4th place went to Columbia, Princeton, and Yale, respectively. 3rd place, Alexandra Torres, her face flickering with disappointment at not ranking higher despite her perfect credentials. 2nd, Jennifer Park from Harvard, accepting with gracious professionalism that didn't quite hide her frustration. Victoria paused before announcing 1st place, letting silence build, while cameras captured the moment for the 25,000 people now watching the live stream. Whatever she said next would be recorded, analyzed, shared across social media and academic forums, would become part of a narrative she no longer fully controlled. 1st place with perfect scores on all 3 problems. Marcus Chen, Whitmore University Facilities Department. The auditorium erupted. Half the crowd rose in standing ovation. Others remained seated in shocked silence. The Ivy League contingent exchanging looks that mixed disbelief with something darker, the uncomfortable recognition that their assumptions about merit and credentials might be less absolute than they'd believed. News cameras swiveled toward Marcus, capturing his reaction, which was characteristically understated, a small nod, no smile, just quiet acceptance of a result he'd apparently expected. Reporters swarmed before the applause had fully died, questions overlapping into noise. A young NPR affiliate journalist got through first. "Mr. Chen, how does it feel to beat students from Harvard and MIT?" Marcus's face remained neutral, carefully controlled. "They're all talented mathematicians. I just see problems differently." CNN's producer, sharp-eyed and aggressive, pushed closer. "What's your educational background? Where did you study?" The question hung dangerous in the air, inviting revelation or requiring deception. Marcus chose ambiguity. "I've studied independently, taken courses here and there. Mathematics doesn't require expensive institutions if you're willing to work." The non-answer satisfied reporters, while revealing nothing maintained the careful separation between his public persona and hidden credentials. Victoria watched him navigate the media scrum with practiced evasion, giving answers that sounded responsive without actually disclosing information, and felt grudging admiration for his skill at protecting himself while meeting minimum obligations. Richard Bradford materialized at her elbow, his expression thunderous. "This is absurd. There's no way he solved those problems legitimately." Victoria kept her voice low but firm. "I watched him the entire time. There was no cheating." "Then explain it." "Janitors don't outperform Harvard PhD candidates by that margin." "Maybe our assumptions about janitors are the problem." Richard stared at her like she'd suggested the earth was flat. You can't seriously be defending this circus. He's making a mockery of academic standards. He's demonstrating that talent exists outside traditional pathways. That's not mockery, that's reality we've been ignoring. Richard made a disgusted sound and walked away, leaving Victoria alone with the uncomfortable realization that defending Marcus meant questioning everything she'd spent her career believing. The competition was supposed to validate her worldview, prove that proper credentials and formal training produce superior results. Instead, it was revealing that brilliance could emerge from unexpected places, that the carefully maintained hierarchies she'd climbed were more permeable than she'd ever admitted. Mitchell approached through the thinning crowd, her expression gentle but knowing. That young man has a very distinctive mathematical style. Victoria's pulse quickened with recognition of where this was heading. You've seen it before. Not a question. Sarah nodded slowly. I had a doctoral student once. Brilliant beyond measure, saw connections others missed, preferred geometric insight to algebraic manipulation. That telescoping series solution, it's exactly how he would have approached the problem. Marcus L. Chen, MIT 2014 to 2018. Sarah's eyes widened. You know. I figured it out after he corrected one of my proofs. What happened? Why did he leave? The Stanford professor's face clouded with old pain and fresh regret. Family emergency. His mother's cancer diagnosis required full-time care and financial resources he couldn't maintain while finishing his dissertation. I tried to arrange funding, tried to create flexible schedules that would let him continue, but he was adamant. His mother came first. And you let him go. I had no choice. You can't force someone to stay when they've decided the cost is too high. Mitchell's voice carried 5 years of guilt, of wondering whether she could have done more, fought harder, found some arrangement that would have prevented the loss of a once-in-a-generation talent. Victoria understood that weight intimately. She carried her own versions, different circumstances, but the same fundamental question of whether better choices were possible. Why didn't you tell me he was competing? Because it's his story to share or conceal as he chooses. I've learned that people have reasons for their decisions, and assuming I know better usually causes more harm than good. The judging panel dispersed while Victoria fielded questions from Dean Morrison and department chairs who'd materialized to understand what had just happened. She gave diplomatic answers, emphasized mathematical merit rather than narrative drama, tried to maintain professional boundaries even as her mind raced with implications. Marcus Chen wasn't an anomaly or a fluke. He was a proven mathematician operating at elite levels despite circumstances that would have destroyed most people. That recognition should have brought relief validation that talent could transcend institutional barriers. Instead, Victoria felt her worldview cracking fundamental assumptions about merit, revealing themselves as more contingent than she'd ever acknowledged. The afternoon dissolved into evening as the auditorium emptied. Marcus had disappeared immediately after the media scrum, vanishing before Victoria could catch him for private conversation. She imagined him somewhere quiet, processing the enormity of what he'd just done and what would inevitably follow now that invisibility was no longer an option. Because something had been set in motion that couldn't be stopped. The story was already spreading through academic Twitter and mathematics, Reddit hitting local news sites and threatening to break national. Hashtags formed organically, had janitor genius, hashed Marcus Chen, trending in academic circles and beyond. The narrative practically wrote itself: working class hero challenges, elite system proves intelligence transcends credentials, offers hope to everyone who'd been told they didn't belong. Victoria drove home through autumn twilight, Connecticut's fall colors muted by fading light. Her penthouse apartment felt emptier than usual, its expensive minimalism suddenly seeming sterile rather than sophisticated. She stood at the windows watching campus lights activate across the quad, thinking about the man who just upended her certainties and wondering what came next. Her phone buzzed continuously, Richard's still angry colleagues offering congratulations, while carefully avoiding the elephant in the room, Dean Morrison requesting a Monday meeting to discuss publicity management and next steps. Only one message actually mattered from Sarah Mitchell, sent at 8:15. I know this complicates your beliefs, but that young man deserves a chance to reclaim what he lost. Sometimes the best thing we can do is stop blocking someone's path. Victoria read it 3 times, searching for hidden agenda. found only truth delivered with the clarity that came from experience and regret. Mitchell had lost Marcus once to circumstances beyond anyone's control. She wasn't going to stand by and watch institutional inertia or defensive pride create new barriers. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by dreams of whiteboards and equations of Marcus's dark eyes watching with that unreadable expression of her younger self standing before Professor Whitmore as he dismissed her potential based on background she couldn't change. The dreams blurred past and present until Victoria couldn't separate her experiences from Marcus's, her struggles, from his sacrifices. Sunday morning brought unwelcome viral fame. Competition footage had been edited into highlight reels. Marcus's elegant solutions contrasted with competitors' laborious calculations, his visual proofs explained in accessible language, his post-competition interview edited to emphasize humility and determination. The video hit 1 million views by noon, climbing faster as it jumped from mathematics communities into mainstream platforms. Comment sections became battlegrounds. Supporters celebrated Marcus as proof that meritocracy could work, that exceptional ability would always find recognition. Critics claimed the entire thing was staged, that no legitimate mathematician would work as a janitor, that something didn't add up. Others focused on institutional failure. How could a university employ someone with PhD-level credentials in facilities management without recognizing his abilities? Whitmore's administration noticed. Dean Morrison called an emergency Sunday meeting assembling stakeholders in his oak-paneled office. Victoria arrived to find the facilities director already present, looking defensive, along with human resources communications, and Provost Patricia Langford, a formidable woman who'd built her career on managing institutional reputation. The provost opened without pleasantries. Dr. Hayes explained how we have a former MIT doctoral candidate cleaning our buildings. Victoria spread her hands, refusing to accept blame for systemic failures. HR handles employment verification. I had no knowledge of Mr. Chen's background until recently. The facilities director jumped in. He listed high school diploma on his application. We don't require transcripts for maintenance positions. And it never occurred to anyone to wonder why someone might be overqualified. Silence greeted the provost's question. The truth was obvious and damning. Nobody had wondered because nobody cared to look closely at service personnel, had assumed that anyone working facilities lacked credentials for anything better, had let unconscious bias create massive institutional blind spots. The communications director flipped through her tablet. This story is everywhere. NPR wants interviews. CNN is sending crews tomorrow. The Times is working on a feature. We need to control the narrative before it becomes about Whitmore's failure to recognize talent. Victoria's voice cut through the bureaucratic anxiety. Isn't that exactly what it is? Dr. Langford's expression hardened. What it is and what we allow it to become are different things. Dr. Hayes, I understand Mr. Chen advances to semifinals. He placed first. Of course he advances. And if he wins the entire competition, then he wins. The rules are clear. The provost and dean exchanged loaded glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. When Langford spoke again, her voice carried careful weight. Whitmore cannot afford to be seen as an institution that employed doctoral-level mathematicians as janitors while charging students $65,000 annually for qualified instruction. The implication landed like a physical blow. Victoria felt anger rising hot and sharp. Are you suggesting we disqualify him on what grounds? I'm suggesting we find solutions that protect the university's reputation while acknowledging Mr. Chen's obvious abilities. Translation: make this problem disappear. Offer Marcus incentives to withdraw, spin his employment as clerical error, rather than systematic blindness. Victoria had witnessed this kind of damage control before, had participated when departmental politics demanded choosing expediency over truth. Not this time. Marcus Chen earned his place through mathematical merit. He continues under the same rules as every other contestant. If the administration has problems with employment practices, address them separately. But don't punish someone for revealing failures we should have caught ourselves. The meeting deteriorated into circular arguments about reputation versus principle, about obligations to various stakeholders. Victoria held her ground through 2 hours of bureaucratic pressure, refusing to budge on Marcus's right to compete fairly. Finally, the provost declared they would reconvene after consulting legal counsel and the board. Walking out into crisp October air, Victoria felt simultaneously triumphant and exhausted. She'd defended Marcus's participation, but had also painted a target on her own back. Provosts and deans remembered faculty who made their jobs difficult, who chose principle over institutional convenience. Her phone rang, Richard calling for what felt like the 100th time since yesterday. I heard about the meeting. Please tell me you're not actually going to let this continue. Victoria's patience, already stretched thin, snapped completely. Marcus Chen is a legitimate mathematician who earned his place. Your inability to accept that reveals your limitations, not his. My limitations, I'm trying to protect you from career suicide. By doing what disqualifying the most talented contestant because he doesn't fit your preconceptions. Richard's voice went cold. I think you need to examine why you're so invested in defending someone you barely know. This isn't about mathematics anymore. The accusation stung because it brushed against truth Victoria wasn't ready to examine. But Richard's condescension, his assumption that her judgment must be emotionally compromised rather than ethically grounded, crystallized something that had been building. We're done, Richard. This relationship, whatever it was, I don't want to see you anymore. Don't be ridiculous. You're throwing away 2 years over some janitor. Victoria ended the call and immediately blocked his number. The breakup should have hurt more, should have carried weight of loss or regret. Instead, she felt lighter, like she'd shed a heavy coat she'd been wearing without realizing how much it restricted her movement. Sunday evening found Victoria alone in her department office, ostensibly catching up on work, but really just avoiding the empty apartment that suddenly felt like a monument to choices she'd made for the wrong reasons. The stack of midterm exams sat untouched while her mind replayed the day's events. The emergency meeting, the confrontation with Richard, the growing realization that defending Marcus Chen meant questioning the entire framework she'd used to understand her own success. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Marcus stood in the doorway, back in his coveralls, cleaning cart beside him. They looked at each other for a long moment, the air heavy with everything that had happened since Saturday morning. Dr. Hayes, Marcus, neither seemed to know how to proceed. Finally, Victoria gestured toward the chair across from her desk. Do you have a minute? He hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity and whatever protective instincts had kept him hidden for 5 years. But he came in, settled into the chair with careful dignity, hands folded in his lap exactly as they'd been during the qualifying round. Victoria chose her words carefully. I spoke with Dr. Mitchell yesterday. She told me about MIT, about your mother's illness, about the choice you had to make. Marcus's shoulders tensed, but his face remained neutral. Then you understand why I didn't advertise my background. What I don't understand is why you're competing now. You've spent years staying invisible. The Euler's challenge destroys that completely. The silence stretched long enough that Victoria thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight that suggested he'd been wrestling with the same question. I'm tired of hiding, of pretending to be less than I am, of watching everything I built slowly dissolve while I empty trash cans. The prize money would help my mother, but more than that, I need to know if I still have it. If 5 years away has destroyed what I worked so hard to create, or if mathematics is durable enough to survive. The honesty in his admission resonated with Victoria's own fears, the constant anxiety that her abilities might evaporate if she stopped pushing, stopped proving herself in an endless cycle of achievement and validation. Dr. Mitchell says you were the most talented student she ever advised. Marcus's laugh was bitter. Dr. Mitchell is generous with her assessments. She doesn't strike me as someone prone to exaggeration. Their eyes met, and Victoria saw defensive pride beneath his carefully maintained neutrality, the same armor she wore when feeling vulnerable. Then maybe I was talented. Past tense. The semifinals will tell us if anything survived. You're having doubts. I'm being realistic about what happens to skills when you don't use them. Those students I competed against have been training constantly. I've been mopping floors and stocking grocery shelves, and still solved problems faster than all of them. Basic problems. The semifinals will be different. He was right. Victoria had designed the next round to test graduate-level knowledge material that required active engagement with current research. Marcus's classical approaches had served him beautifully in qualifying, but advanced topics demanded familiarity with modern techniques and recent developments. The offer escaped before she'd fully thought it through. I could help. Tutoring sessions refresh her on modern methods. 2 weeks before semifinals, I could get you up to speed on what you've missed. Marcus studied her with open skepticism. Why would you do that? Victoria searched for an answer that made sense beyond the complicated tangle of guilt and admiration and identification she felt watching him fight. Because wasting talent for lack of opportunity offends every principle I claim to value. Because you deserve a fair chance. Because it's the right thing to do. He considered her with that unreadable expression, weighing sincerity against suspicion. I work nights. When would we meet? Early mornings before my first class. 6 a.m. in my office. That's 3 hours after my shift ends. Can you manage it? Marcus smiled, tired but genuine. I've done harder things on less sleep. Okay, starting tomorrow. They shook hands, the gesture feeling absurdly formal for the agreement they just reached. Marcus stood to leave but paused at the door. Dr. Hayes, thank you for defending my right to compete. I heard about the administration meeting. How did you? Janitors hear everything. We're invisible, remember? He left before she could respond, his cart squeaking away down the corridor. Victoria sat alone, wondering what she'd committed to and whether she'd regret it. Helping Marcus succeed would validate approaches that challenged her own, would prove that mathematical insight could develop outside formal structures she'd spent her life defending. But maybe that discomfort was exactly the point. Maybe growth required friction, the necessary abrasion that either strengthened convictions or forced building new ones based on evidence rather than assumption. Marcus's MIT years surfaced in fragments over the following days as Victoria pieced together his story from Sarah Mitchell's memories and careful questions during their morning sessions. The narrative emerged in reverse, like developing a photograph. First the outline, then the details filling in until the full picture became visible. 2014 had brought an acceptance letter that changed everything. Marcus receiving MIT's offer while working double shifts at a restaurant in Boston's Chinatown, his mother crying with joy, despite knowing they couldn't really afford it, despite the scholarship covering tuition, but not living expenses or the cost of books, or the 1,000 small fees that accumulated. His father had been dead 3 years by then killed in a construction accident that left the family financially precarious, but Marcus's talent was undeniable, and MIT didn't make offers lightly. The first year brought culture shock that nearly broke him. Classmates from Exeter and Andover discussing summer programs at Princeton, comparing notes on courses they'd already taken at elite high schools that offered more mathematics than Marcus's entire public school curriculum. He'd felt like an imposter, convinced that admissions had made a mistake, that he'd be exposed as inadequate the moment courses started. But then the mathematics began and everything changed. In Dr. Mitchell's real analysis course, Marcus solved a challenge problem that had stumped the class for weeks, his approach so elegant that Sarah had spent the next seminar breaking down his proof to show everyone else how he'd seen connections they'd missed. The solution used geometric insight where everyone else had tried algebraic manipulation, visual thinking that bypassed technical complications through pure understanding of underlying structure. Sarah had called him to her office afterward, this young professor with kind eyes and genuine enthusiasm for teaching. Marcus, your proof was remarkable. Have you considered research mathematics? He'd been confused, uncertain what she meant. I'm just a first year. I thought research was for later. Talent doesn't wait for permission. I'd like you to join my research group. Those words had opened doors Marcus hadn't known existed. By his second year, he was attending seminars with PhD candidates contributing ideas that sometimes proved more insightful than those from students years ahead of him. His first publication came during his third year, a paper on convergence properties that extended classical results using techniques so old they'd been largely forgotten, resurrected by Marcus's reading of 19th century mathematics texts that modern students ignored. The years blurred into a golden period where everything seemed possible. Marcus thrived in MIT's intense environment, found community among other graduate students who lived and breathed mathematics, briefly dated a fellow student named Anna, though the relationship dissolved under the pressure of their work. His mother visited campus once, beaming with pride, as he showed her the department, introduced her to Sarah, let her see the life he was building. Then 2018 arrived with a phone call that ended everything. Marcus had been in a seminar half listening to a presentation on functional analysis when his phone vibrated. He'd ignored it initially. You didn't answer calls during academic presentations. But it kept vibrating urgent and insistent, and when he finally stepped into the hallway, his mother's oncologist delivered words that rewrote his future in seconds. Stage 3 breast cancer, aggressive. We need to start treatment immediately. The details came in fragments he could barely process through the roaring in his ears. Chemotherapy, radiation surgery, a treatment plan that would cost hundreds of thousands even with insurance. His mother would need full-time care, would be too sick to work, would require someone managing medications and appointments, and the daily logistics of survival. Marcus had 1 semester remaining on his dissertation, 1 semester between him and the PhD that would justify the 5 years of poverty and effort in deferred gratification. But his mother had spent her whole life sacrificing for him, and his sister had worked 2 jobs to keep them fed after their father died, had never once suggested that her needs mattered more than theirs. The meeting with Sarah Mitchell remained burned into his memory with painful clarity. I need to withdraw. Sarah's face had gone white. No, we'll find the funding, arrange flexible schedules, create something that lets you finish. She needs 24-hour care. I'm all she has. You're 1 semester away, Marcus. 1 semester from everything you've worked toward. His voice had broken on the response. Math will still be here in 5 years. My mother won't. Sarah had cried, which made it worse, somehow, this brilliant professor who understood exactly what he was giving up and could do nothing to prevent it. She'd written a letter promising that MIT would readmit him whenever he was ready, had extracted promises that he'd stay in touch, maintain the connections that might someday lead him back. But life didn't work that way. Medical bills consumed everything. Marcus's savings, his mother's retirement account, eventually forcing them to sell the small house in Chinatown and move Linda into long-term care when her condition deteriorated beyond what home treatment could manage. Marcus took whatever jobs he could find that paid enough, first at a grocery store, then adding night custodial work at Whitmore when the combined income from both still barely covered facility costs. Mathematics became something he did in stolen moments in notebooks, hidden in his locker, in his mind during long hours of physical labor. The papers he'd published collected dust in some digital archive, his name gradually fading from people's memory as new students and new research pushed the field forward without him. 5 years dissolved in the gap between who he'd been and who he'd become until the Euler's Challenge offered a possibility of bridging that distance. Monday morning brought their first tutoring session. Marcus arrived at exactly 6 a.m., having finished his shift 3 hours earlier, looking like exhaustion given human form. Dark circles under his eyes, slight tremor in his hands when he picked up chalk, but his mind remained sharp as they worked through topology problems that would have challenged most PhD candidates. Victoria outlined modern approaches to fixed-point theorems, building carefully from basics. Marcus stopped her after 10 minutes. I know this. Dr. Mitchell covered it in my 3rd year. She recalibrated, moved to operator theory. Covered. That was my minor field. They ran through topics systematically, Victoria discovering that Marcus's graduate training had been more complete than she'd assumed. The gaps existed but were narrower than expected, specific techniques developed after 2018. New approaches to old problems, recent breakthroughs that had shifted how certain areas were understood. The foundation was solid. They just needed to update his knowledge patch holes that 5 years had created. The sessions transformed from remedial tutoring into genuine collaboration. Marcus asked questions that pushed Victoria's understanding, challenged assumptions she'd internalized without examination, suggested alternatives that occasionally proved more elegant than standard methods. By 7:30, they'd covered material that normally required a full semester, both energized despite running on caffeine and willpower. The pattern established itself quickly. Mornings with Marcus covering advanced mathematics, days filled with teaching and administrative duties in managing fallout from the competition's growing fame, evenings grading and preparing next day's material. Victoria found herself thinking about Marcus during lectures, wondering if he was sleeping or working another shift, hoping the strain wasn't too much, because the strain was visible and worsening. By Friday, Marcus was falling asleep mid-problem, his head dropping forward onto folded arms. Victoria let him rest, working quietly while he slept for 20 minutes before jerking awake with confused apologies. You need actual rest, not power naps between shifts. His laugh carried zero humor. Rest requires time I don't have. Bills don't pause because I'm tired. Can you reduce hours somewhere? And how do I pay for my mother's care, buy food, make rent? The question hung unanswerable between them. Victoria's privileged perspective made her suggestions useless. She'd never had to choose between sleep and survival, had never calculated whether skipping meals would free up money for other necessities. She made the offer before fully considering implications. What if I paid you research assistant position, 20 hours weekly standard academic salary? Marcus shook his head immediately. I can't accept charity. It's not charity. I need help with my research. You have qualifications. This is normal academic employment. No one will believe you hired a janitor as a research assistant. Let me worry about appearances. You focus on getting rest and winning this competition. They argued for 15 minutes, Marcus's pride colliding with Victoria's determination, both recognizing that offering and accepting help crossed complicated boundaries. Finally, Marcus agreed to a compromise. He'd reduce grocery store hours, Victoria would provide a modest stipend for consulting, and they'd continue morning sessions through semifinals. The arrangement felt dangerous in ways Victoria couldn't articulate. She was crossing lines between professor and student, between benefactor and recipient, between professional interest and something more personal that she wasn't ready to name. But stopping felt worse, like abandoning someone drowning within arm's reach, because saving them might be inappropriate. Social media continued amplifying Marcus's story throughout the week. The hashtags evolved, #JanitorProf joining #MarcusChen supporters, claiming he represented everything right about meritocracy, while critics pointed to him as evidence of everything wrong. How could someone so talented fall through institutional cracks? What did his story reveal about millions who never got second chances? News coverage intensified as semifinals approached. CNN produced a profile framing Marcus as a folk hero, working-class son of immigrants sacrificing dreams for family. NPR took analytical angles interviewing education experts about credentialism and hidden talent pools. Conservative outlets praised him as proof that individual merit mattered more than systemic barriers, conveniently ignoring the 5 years he'd spent invisible because those same barriers made him unrecognizable. Marcus hated all of it, the attention, the speculation, the narrativization of his life into digestible content. He refused interviews, deflected reporters who ambushed him outside the facilities, building maintained privacy that had protected him for years. But privacy was no longer an option. The story had escaped his control, belonged now to everyone who found meaning or validation or warning in his circumstances. Thursday brought Victoria's own reckoning with her past, triggered by a conversation with Dr. Kim during a department meeting. The soft-spoken algebraist mentioned diversity initiatives, again pushed gently for reconsidering how they identified talent. Marcus Chen proves we're missing people. How many others are out there working jobs beneath their capabilities because we can't see past credentials? Victoria felt something crack inside her, the careful armor she'd maintained suddenly feeling too heavy to carry. That evening alone in her office, she let herself remember things she'd spent years trying to forget. Rural Ohio, 1998. Victoria Hayes at 18, arriving at Ohio State with 2 suitcases and a scholarship that covered tuition, but nothing else. Her roommate Ashley from Columbus's wealthy suburbs, unpacking designer clothes and talking about her family's vacation home in Hilton Head. The casual cruelty of wealth that didn't even recognize itself as cruel. Professor Arthur Whitmore had been a visiting lecturer from Harvard, distinguished and intimidating someone whose approval could launch careers or whose dismissal could end them. Victoria had raised her hand in his advanced calculus course, answered a difficult question, brilliantly felt pride warming her chest at demonstrating her ability. Then Whitmore's question delivered with polite interest. Impressive reasoning. Where did you prepare? Which academy? Fairview High School, sir. Public school in rural Ohio. The shift in his expression had been subtle but unmistakable, interest cooling into skepticism, engagement, withdrawing into polite dismissal. Ah, well, natural talent only carries one so far. Real mathematics requires proper foundation, the kind of systematic training that preparatory schools provide. The words had landed like physical blows, each one leaving bruises that didn't show but never fully healed. Victoria had approached him after class, gathering courage. "Sir, I'd like to work in your research group. I've been studying independently." Whitmore had looked her up and down, his gaze cataloging everything that marked her as different from his usual students. "My dear students, from your background, rarely succeed in pure mathematics. Perhaps applied mathematics would be more suitable. Something practical." The condescension had been wrapped in concern, which made it worse somehow. Victoria had fled to her dorm room and cried for hours, holding her acceptance letter and scholarship notification, tangible proof of merit that apparently didn't matter when weighed against background she couldn't change. That night had forged something hard inside her, transformed hurt into determination. She would be so successful that no one could ever question her again, would accumulate credentials until her background became irrelevant, would build walls so thick that dismissal couldn't penetrate. And she had. Graduated summa cum laude, gained admission to Harvard's PhD program, published in top journals, secured the tenure-track position, and eventually department chair. Each achievement, another brick in the wall, another piece of armor against the vulnerabilities she'd felt in Whitmore's office. But somewhere in the process, she'd become the thing she'd hated. Had started using credentials as weapons, had dismissed people who lacked proper pedigrees, had defended systems that hurt others the way she'd been hurt. The armor had calcified into something that protected her from growth as much as from pain. Marcus Chen was forcing her to confront that calcification, to see that the walls she'd built to protect herself had become barriers that excluded others. His success, despite institutional neglect, challenged every justification she'd constructed for maintaining rigid hierarchies. If he could be brilliant while cleaning toilets, what did that say about her assumption that credentials measured worth? The thought terrified her because it suggested her own success might be less about exceptional ability and more about fortunate access, about being born into circumstances that made her visible to the right people at the right times. Everything she'd accomplished suddenly felt contingent, provisional, dependent on advantages she'd never examined, because acknowledging them would undermine the meritocratic narrative she'd embraced. Semifinals arrived on a Saturday that felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. 6 contestants remained the field winnowed, from 12 each one, carrying credentials that should have guaranteed their advancement. Jennifer Park, David Richardson, Alexandra Torres, the Ivy League elite who'd probably never questioned their right to be in spaces like this. Then Marcus Chen in his coveralls, Rachel Goldman from Princeton, and James Wilson from Stanford. The auditorium packed with 800 spectators, far exceeding typical attendance for academic competitions. Live stream viewers peaked at 50,000 before the round even began, the number climbing as word spread through social media. News crews occupied dedicated media sections, cameras positioned to capture every moment of drama that was rapidly becoming less about mathematics and more about class warfare disguised as academic competition. Victoria stood at the podium, feeling the weight of expectations that had nothing to do with mathematical excellence and everything to do with narrative. Would the underdog prevail, or would proper training demonstrate its superiority? She designed today's problems to test genuine understanding. Not just clever pattern recognition, had selected questions that required deep knowledge of modern techniques. The problem appeared on screens throughout the auditorium, its technical language intimidating even to mathematics graduate students. Prove convergence and analyze behavior of a specific infinite series using advanced analysis methods. To casual observers, it looked impossibly complex. To mathematicians, it represented a standard qualifying exam question that separated people who understood the field from those who'd merely memorized formulas. Jennifer and David deployed the expected techniques immediately: epsilon delta arguments, comparison tests, sophisticated convergence theorems developed in the past decade. Their boards filled with formal manipulations that would satisfy any analysis professor, technically flawless demonstrations of having mastered modern mathematical machinery. Marcus sat motionless for a full minute, staring at the problem while his competitors filled their boards. Victoria's pulse quickened. Was he stuck? Had the material exceeded what their morning sessions had covered? Maybe the 5-year gap was too large to bridge in 2 weeks. Then Marcus began drawing, not equations but simple graphs showing the series behavior, visual representations that made the abstract concrete. He sketched how terms grew and shrank, how the sum accumulated or diverged, building intuition before deploying formal proof. When he finally wrote symbolic arguments, they flowed directly from the geometric understanding he'd constructed, classical methods that bypassed modern complications through pure insight. His explanation to the audience delivered via microphone when judges requested clarification made graduate-level analysis accessible to laypeople. Think of it like a bouncing ball. Sometimes bounces get smaller and eventually stop, that's convergence. Sometimes they get bigger forever, that's divergence. The mathematics tells us which behavior we're seeing. The auditorium responded with appreciation that transcended academic boundaries. This wasn't just correct mathematics, it was beautiful mathematics, the kind that revealed why truth was true rather than just proving it was. Dr. Mitchell stood and applauded openly, her eyes shining with something that looked like pride or vindication or relief. Results came swiftly. 3 contestants would advance: Jennifer Park, whose technical mastery was undeniable, David Richardson, representing Harvard's finest, and Marcus Chen, whose approach had been unconventional but irrefutable. The live stream exploded with celebration and controversy in equal measure. Mathematical Twitter divided into camps, some praising Marcus's accessibility, while others questioned whether visual proofs demonstrated sufficient rigor. The debate missed the point: his solutions were mathematically sound, regardless of presentation style, satisfied every requirement, while also revealing deeper structure than purely formal approaches captured. Victoria watched Marcus navigate post-competition media with the same careful evasion he'd employed after qualifiers. Still protecting his MIT credentials, still maintaining the carefully constructed separation between public persona and private history. She understood the strategy, but wondered how long he could sustain it. That evening, Victoria crafted the finals problem alone in her office, selecting a challenge from her own doctoral dissertation. Something she'd spent 3 years solving with full institutional support, unlimited time access to experts and resources. Now she was compressing it into a 90-minute format, simplifying slightly, but preserving the essential difficulty that had once felt insurmountable. The problem required knowledge spanning multiple fields: functional analysis, operator theory, partial differential equations. It demanded the kind of deep technical expertise that came from years of immersion in current research. Victoria told herself she was maintaining standards, testing whether contestants could function at professional levels. But part of her knew the truth. This was a test aimed at Marcus, designed to reveal whether his classical approaches could handle modern complexity, whether his self-study and 2 weeks of tutoring could compete with Jennifer and David's uninterrupted graduate training. She was creating a crucible that would either prove his brilliance was complete or expose it as limited, beautiful within certain bounds, but ultimately insufficient for the hardest problems. Her phone buzzed, and Sarah Mitchell calling at 9 p.m., unusual enough to make Victoria answer immediately. "I saw your draft problem for finals. It's from your dissertation." "Yes," and Sarah's voice carried gentle warning. "That problem nearly broke you, Victoria. It took you 3 years with full advisor support. You're giving them 90 minutes. I simplified it, made it more accessible." Did you make it just accessible enough to be solvable by someone with complete modern training while remaining nearly impossible for someone using classical methods? The accuracy of the observation stung. Victoria had no response that wouldn't sound defensive or dishonest. Sarah continued after a pause. "Marcus deserves a fair test, not a rigged game. If you're going to judge him, judge what he can do, not what he can't." After they hung up, Victoria stared at her computer screen where the problem glowed in latex formatting. Sarah was right, and she'd designed this to favor conventional approaches, had unconsciously created barriers that protected her belief system more than they tested genuine mathematical ability. She spent the next hour revising, softening some technical requirements, opening pathways that classical methods might navigate. Not making it easier, just making it fairer, acknowledging that mathematics had more than one valid approach to truth. By midnight, she had a problem that satisfied her conscience, if not her fear. Finals would test everyone equally, would require brilliance rather than just training, would reveal who among them could think most deeply about structure, underlying symbols. Marcus Chen would either prove himself equal to the challenge or he wouldn't. But at least Victoria would know she'd given him a real chance rather than setting him up to fail in ways that confirmed her pre-existing assumptions. The question was whether she was ready for whatever truth emerged, whether she had the courage to rebuild her understanding if Marcus succeeded, or the honesty to examine her own limitations if he didn't. 2 weeks remained until finals. 2 weeks for Marcus to prepare for media attention, to intensify for Victoria to decide what kind of person she wanted to be when this was over. The stakes had escalated beyond a campus competition into something that would reshape multiple lives in ways no equation could predict.